I know that, it's a difficult situation because you have the far right who also hijack the issue of Sharia law in order to promote their racist and anti-immigrant and inhuman agenda. And I actually think that the far right and Islamism are two sides of the same coin. They're both very much far right movements that are inhuman, violent, misogynist, homophobic, and belong not in this century, really. But I think that, in a sense, if good people don't speak out against Sharia law and Sharia courts, it leaves the space open for the far right to do that in its inhuman, in a way that attacks people. From my perspective, opposing Sharia law is a defense of Muslim women and a defense of human rights, even if there are people who say they choose to go to these courts. Because as I said before, the voluntary nature of these courts is questionable, given the pressures and intimidations that are involved, given the fact that many people didn't have to go to these courts 30, 40 years ago. They didn't exist in many countries as they do, and they do today. And also I think when you're dealing with laws that actually violate people's rights, it's the question of choice is very questionable. If you look at, for example, there's a Oriental Studies Department in India. They did a study on sati, the practice of women throwing themselves on the burning pyres of their husbands. And they said that in the study that they did, there were 40 eyewitness accounts of women throwing themselves on the burning pyres, and only 2 of the cases were involuntary. The rest of the cases were voluntary. The women chose to throw themselves on the burning pyres of their husbands, and therefore it's acceptable. And I think we need to look at the pressures and intimidations that are involved that make it seem as if Sharia law and courts are acceptable when in fact they're not. They shouldn't be accepted in any way, shape, and form. I guess I want to end by saying a few things. I think opposing Sharia courts and saying that Sharia courts are a violation of human rights is not an attack on Muslims. And I think this needs to be very clear. The example I always give is, I don't like FGM. I oppose female genital mutilation. It's not an attack on girls and women who've been mutilated. I don't like poverty. It's not an attack on people who are poor. And in a sense, attacking that which is discriminatory, misogynist, homophobic, unfair in its civil code, and truly barbaric and medieval in its penal code is a defense of people's rights and a defense of 21st century values and norms. It's also not necessarily anti-Islam. I myself am against religion. I think religions are equal and equally bad, in my opinion. But I don't think necessarily an attack on Sharia law and Sharia courts is an attack on Islam, because people obviously have the right to believe anything they want, in the same way that I have a right to believe in anything I want. But having Sharia courts is a very different matter. It's a very different matter, and I think it's linked to the rise of Islamism, and fighting Islamism is something that actually Muslims and people living in the Middle East, in North Africa, and under Islamic rule have been at the forefront of battling, and Muslims have often been the first victims of Sharia law and Islamism. I don't think it's a question of being tolerant and being anti-racist to defend Sharia courts. I think it's quite the opposite. The very idea of difference is the fundamental basis of a racist agenda. It's not the other way around, not the other way around. Saying that different people deserve to have different rights because of where they come from, because of their religious beliefs, is very racist in my opinion, and it's something that has to be opposed. From my perspective, Sharia law is the same as saying human rights violations, in my opinion. It violates rights, left, right, and center. I know people will say that, this is not Sharia law, but the reality is that Sharia law is being implemented in many countries across the world. And we see what it represents day in and day out. If you don't like Iran because it's Shia, That's what I often hear. Well, look at the situation in Saudi Arabia. If you don't like Saudi Arabia, you don't think that's real Islam, well, look at what's happening in Afghanistan. You don't think Afghanistan is real Islam, well, then look at what's happening in Iraq. There's always an excuse for why this is not proper Islam, and that's fine. I believe that there are a lot of people who are Muslims, including my parents, who are wonderful people who respect human rights and whose lives are not antithetical to human rights. But that's not the same as saying that Sharia law is, one and the same with respecting human rights. It's not. It's a difference between people and a legal court and laws that are actually part and parcel of the political Islamic movement's attempts at restricting and limiting and negating rights, not the other way around. Thank you very much.